Hello, and welcome to the Beginning of Wisdom Live. I'm Andrew Schumacher, and it's a wonderful Thursday evening. I'm glad to be here. Thankful for the life God gave me. I'm really glad to be here tonight, and glad to talk about something I think is pretty important. If you saw a thumbnail or a title or something, it might have given you a clue about what we're talking about. Tonight, we are going to be discussing the recent debate between Dr. R.L. Solberg and David Wilber on the subject of Acts 15 and the question, did the apostles require the Gentiles to keep the law of Moses in Acts 15? And it's going to be, I think, interesting. I've heard a few things. I haven't watched every review out there. I did watch the whole debate. I did watch some of the post-debate stuff that both debaters put out. But, and initially I thought, I'll let it go, but then somebody asked, so here I am. But I really did think I had some things to discuss about it, and so I'm looking forward to doing that. But, before I jump all the way in, good to see some folks here. I see Eric Keaton Porter. Good to see you, sir. I see you cannot wait, and I also cannot wait to get into all this. I'm going to check some stuff. Let's see if... oh no, I can't. So anyway, there's things I want to see. Can we do this? Hey, look at that. Good. I can show your chats today. That doesn't always work. So this is a one-man operation, and most of my hours are not spent doing this. So I do what I can. Anyway, let's see. Is there anything I need to announce? Not really. Not much going on other than, various projects I'm working on right now that I can't tell you about. But because it would give you a false sense of what to expect, and I don't want to do that. But yeah, I've got a lot of things I'm excited about and working on right now, but this is something that I was looking forward to talking about. So let's go ahead and, we can jump right into it. So I wanted to kind of give this my own take. I don't normally get into, heavily into debates. I do watch them from time to time, especially if it's somebody I really care about and especially good debaters that I really like. I think I've caught just about every Anthony Rogers debate I can get my hands on, stuff like that. But, it's just not always my thing. Though I do enjoy them. I've done a few of them. I haven't done a whole lot of them, but I have done some and plan to do more at some point. But I always look at these things as like, is there anything I can really add to the conversation? Is there anything valuable I can give? And that's really my goal in anything. And I don't really pretend to be someone who can adjudicate winners and losers in debates or anything like that. But, listening to this particular debate, I did have some thoughts and some criticisms for both sides, honestly. Obviously not, equally in every regard, but I did have some thoughts. And, mostly, I'm interested in evaluating the arguments. Are these good arguments? How might, I have done things, stuff like that. And that's not to really, second guess anybody, but just how different people look at things differently. And a lot of times I look at debaters and I say, dang, that's way better than I would have done in that in that situation. because the background someone had, it was just they were prepared in a way that I likely would not have been. And I think so. I'm really thankful whenever I see that. So, what I want to do tonight is I'm really interested in, like I said, the arguments, and what I want to discuss is some of the way this debate was set up, the arguments that were made, and really evaluating those. Not going to look at every single argument in great detail, but I'm going to catch some of the big things that I noticed that I think are important to address. So that's kind of, I mean, that's what anyone I think would do in this case. So let me check some things here. Okay, looks like we are looking good, and nobody is yelling at me about sound or anything weird like that, so it seems like we are doing all right. Okay, so let's go ahead, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and pull up this. Well, first of all, let me do this. Let me kind of go over with you the things that I noticed. So what is this debate? So if you didn't hear it, go watch it if you want to. You don't have to, but go do so if you'd like. The debate was on, it's Acts 15, and the resolution, the question was, did the apostles require Gentiles to keep the law of Moses? That was the resolution. And I do appreciate a good yes or no question resolution type of, I mean, the really old school debaters would not have it as a question. They would have it as a statement. And one person, they would say the apostles required Gentiles to keep the law of Moses. And one person would defend that statement, and the other would, seek to prove or undermine that statement, and, it's more of a thing to do it as a question these days. But I do like it better than just saying, a debate about what is Acts 15 about. That's a little harder to stay focused. So I always appreciate when people do that. But I had basically 6 things. I mean, some things kind of overlap, but 6 things that I noticed during the debate that I thought were worth spending some time on. So we're going to talk about the resolution itself and some issues with it. Though it is a good yes or no question, it's not, there are some issues that came up in the debate because of the way the resolution was worded. And so it's a good lesson, I think, for anyone doing debates or thinking about doing debates, that, when you pick a resolution, when you pick that goal, be careful. Make sure you know what everything means in that statement. There were some issues. We're going to see that as we go through. I thought I wanted to talk about the 4 instructions that were given at the Jerusalem Council there in Acts 15, and the way that was discussed in the debate, and what are they, where are they from, are they from the Torah, that kind of stuff. I want to talk briefly about David's use of early church fathers and their, and their discussions of these 4 instructions. And then also the 4th thing is verse 21, which talks about Moses being read in the synagogues, and the inferences made about what that means, the interpretation of that statement, and some comments that were made on both sides regarding that. Number 5, I want to talk about both sides, just really briefly, a little bit about their post-debate content. I thought that was interesting. And then the overall major takeaway, and and this kind of comes back around. It's really going to come back around to the resolution, but that's going to be the major takeaway. So I'm going to start there, and then we'll come back to it, and you'll see why it's so important. So what's the issue with the resolution? Well, the resolution, remember, it's did the apostles require Gentiles to keep the law of Moses? That's the resolution. Well, immediately, my question when I hear that is, what do we mean? What do we mean by require? How are we defining what is a Gentile? I think there wasn't really any disagreement about that, but I would wonder about that because, depending on who you're talking to, that's a question. And then keeping the law of Moses, what does that mean? And I think that as we'll see, there was some difference of opinion about what constituted keeping the law of Moses in terms of this debate. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go start with a few clips of David, who is advocating for the Torah observance position, and some things he said about, what he thought he was debating and what he was arguing for, and everything that he was saying. Now, before I show that, I just want you to think, well, if at this stage, if you haven't seen the debate yet, and I haven't really told you what is the issue with this, think in your mind, what do you think the issue might be? As someone who's really dug deep into this topic, my thought is, well, are we debating the issues that are actually issues today? Are we debating whether people are, required to do things like, keep dietary restrictions, Seventh-day Sabbath, feasts, that kind of stuff? Or has there been any kind of a change? That's what I would think that we're talking about. And we're not really debating the things that we agree about. We agree, about, 9 of the 10 commandments, right? And whether they apply to us the same way that they applied when they were given. We kind of agree about that. We agree about a lot of stuff that's in there. What's the issue? So that's if that sounds like what the debate is to you, then I want you to listen to some of these things that David says, and some of these clips. The first, I'm going to play you like 3 clips, pretty short, about 20 to 30-ish seconds a piece. They're not super long. 2 are from early in the debate, or 1 is from early, this kind of early, midpoint, and near the end. So it's throughout the debate we get this language, and see if you can catch what David's saying and how that applies to what the real issue is between Torah observant people and non-Torah observant. All right, so let's bring it up and let's see what David has to say. I'm gonna make sure that I am looking at the right thing so that I can control it. Okay. So let's hear this first section, and where he's going to talk about what he thinks is the nature of what they're arguing about.
Directly from Leviticus. The apostles were not rejecting the law. They explicitly required Gentile believers to keep the commandments that applied to them as uncircumcised Gentiles. Acts 15:28 calls these commandments requirements. Thus, the text clearly states that the apostles required Gentile believers to keep these parts of the law of Moses, parts that the law itself says apply to Gentiles.
Okay. So, what's he arguing? He's saying these things in the Acts 15 council, he's saying they're from the law and that they apply to Gentiles. Specifically, they're drawn from Leviticus, and they're things that Leviticus say belong, apply to Gentiles, and that's and look, they're from the law of Moses, so obviously, right? I mean, this is the debate is whether they're the law of Moses. There they are. All right, let me jump ahead a bit to the next clip. It is, let's see. All right, let's see right here. Okay. All right, let's listen to this section and see what he says here.
Gentiles to keep these commandments, and the apostles fully affirmed the Torah's ongoing validity. If Rob wants to convince us that the apostles did not require Gentiles to keep the law of Moses, he must explain why he believes the apostolic decree is not required. If he concedes that it is required, then he has conceded the whole debate. Yes, the apostles required Gentiles to keep the law of Moses. Thank you.
All right, that's the end of one of his sections. So he's saying that if R.L. Solberg, if he concedes that these are Torah commands and that they were required to keep them, then he has conceded the whole debate. So, and then I'm going to give you one more section here, and then we'll see where he's at. So this is about 30 minutes in. Okay. Here we go. Last section.
Clarifying question, Rob. Were all 4 commandments of the apostolic decree taken from the law of Moses and required of Gentile believers?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you for confirming. The question in our debate is not how many Torah commandments does Acts 15 explicitly require. The question is whether the apostles required Gentiles to keep the law of Moses. The 4 commandments of the apostolic decree answers that question. They are commandments from the law of Moses, and the apostles call them requirements. Therefore, the apostles required Gentiles to keep the law of Moses. The affirmative case is established even before we discuss anything else beyond the decree. Now,
all right. So, those are the sections I had for you. So, what is David Wilber arguing? What does he think the resolution of the debate means? When the question is, did the apostles require Gentiles to keep the law of Moses? Obviously, he thinks to do that is anything. If it's from the law of Moses and the apostles required Gentiles to do it, then they're requiring them to keep the law of Moses. It doesn't matter, all the other stuff that we actually debate about today in the modern day between Torah observant and non-Torah observant folks. Those things they're not even a part of this debate from David Wilber's perspective. All he thinks he has to do is show that these things, hey, if they're from the law of Moses and apostles required people to keep them, that's the debate. I win. So you can see the issue here. All he had to do to win in his opinion was to establish that anything from the law of Moses means that that the apostles required Gentiles to keep, means they required them to keep the law of Moses. But obviously that brings up the question: what exactly do we mean by the law of Moses? So he goes on in other parts, and I'm not going to play all the clips, but in other parts of the debate, he talks about Ephesians 6 and other places where other stuff from the Torah, stuff from the law of Moses are quoted and discussed as binding on Christians, to give, further examples, things outside of just these 4 instructions. but that's essentially the argument. The and it's interesting, like, why this, why was he, you know, did he even realize, like, did he take the debate and think, this is how I'm going to win this debate? But like, he's not even trying to really establish the Torah observance position in the debate at all. And really, even the position he does seek to establish, it seems like it doesn't matter. It seems like what he's really doing is he's sidestepping the actual, like, not this debate, but the debate between, the ongoing debate about his theology, and just sidestepping that and looking for a way to make for a debate win, or something like that. But what impact does this debate then have on things that Christians have called ceremonial laws and that kind of stuff? I know David denies the distinction, but then one thing that they didn't debate, and it's interesting because the precursors to this debate were David releasing a video on 119 Ministries about Acts 15 and his somewhat peculiar, very peculiar position on it, that he holds that there were that the real debate was not whether the Gentiles had to keep the law of Moses. The real debate was whether Gentiles, while remaining uncircumcised, could keep the law of Moses, and that the whole debate was really just about circumcision. And he came down on a position that Gentiles are not required to be circumcised, like, ever. And that may surprise some people, and I don't think it's the position he's always held. I don't really know. I could go back and maybe try to find something, or someone could ask him. But his position that he made in the video, which and Dr. Solberg responded to, he responded to a number of things, but the defense, the sort of explanation of Acts 15 that he espoused, was to try to reconcile everything, was to say, oh no, Torah observance, keeping the law of Moses, that's all still what Gentiles have to do, but they just don't have to worry about being circumcised. That's specific to the Jews. Very interesting. But that's not really the thing that was being debated at the beginning. That's not the way this debate has gone historically. And then in this debate, that's not what they debated at all. That's not what David sought to defend. He just sought to defend he didn't even defend, and we'll get to this. This will be the next section we talk about. But he, as you heard, Rob agreed that the four instructions were from the law of Moses, and therefore, in David's mind, the debate is over. It's over. You just said it was from the law of Moses, and they were required to do it. Therefore, they were required to keep the law of Moses. That is simple, and that's all David sought to defend in the debate. And the thing is that it was vague enough that it was really difficult. And this is sort of it's a thing. It's a tactic, and I think that it's how do I say, when it comes to debates, and I don't just mean these kind of timed interchanges, but the overall arguments going back and forth about whatever sorts of issues. When it comes to those things, it's very common to have for either side to just characterize things in whatever way suits their side better. So they'll characterize their opponent's positions in ridiculous ways that their opponents would never affirm, and that's called straw man straw manning their opponent. It's a fallacy, and they'll defend their own position on the most modest and easiest to defend grounds that they can do, which is exactly what David did in this debate. His position is actually far more robust and ambitious than what he defended in this debate, and he didn't defend that position. He just defended something much easier. Now, I think there's a way to do this in a rightly, and there's a way to do this in a sort of underhanded and dishonest fashion. And I'm not necessarily accusing David of that. I think he took this debate. It was done very quickly, less than a week, I think, between when I saw Rob challenge him to the debate and when it happened. It was very quick. But the fact is that it's one thing to defend like, is it wrong? Is it some kind of moral failing on David's part that he did this sort of very, very so easy it doesn't even matter kind of position? I mean, not exactly. It's just kind of a waste of everyone's time, because it's not what the issues really are. We don't care. I mean, there are people on a whole spectrum when it comes to Torah observance and God's law and obedience and stuff. There certainly are people on the far legalistic end that teach, salvation comes through obedience to the law, and they don't even have a place for grace and all of that. Like, there's that end of the spectrum, and then there's the far other end of the spectrum that says, God is, his love conquers everything in such a way that everyone will be good, and they're universalists, and they don't think, that anyone should be judged except the people that disagree with them. Nobody's ever really consistent, but there's that sort of completely abandoning any sense of God's demands of us in terms of righteousness and justice and obedience. They completely reject that. The thing is that historically, Christianity is neither of those things. Historically, Christianity has always cared very much about obeying God while holding strongly to salvation through faith in Christ. It has now, and that stuff there's groups certainly, and I'm not going to get into all that. There's, groups that have certainly messed up that basic, outline of what the faith is. But the thing is that because that's been the core of the Christian faith since the beginning and never stopped being that, David is often arguing against, he's often arguing against the complete people who've completely abandoned obedience in any way, and while acting like he's arguing against the standard Christian view. And we kind of see that in this debate near the end. At any rate, that's kind of where, I think that it's kind of a shame that he did it this way, and that the resolution was vague enough to allow for that. When I talk about this topic, you'll often hear me use language that might sound a little cumbersome. And that's because I'm trying to not be vague about it. I don't typically say things like, the law of Moses is no longer in effect. Because what does that even mean? I mean, in the Bible, the law of Moses means different things in different contexts. So which context am I saying that? Yeah. That's an issue. So you often don't hear me even talk about the law of Moses. You hear me say things like, the law is tied to the Sinai covenant, and you'll hear me say things, I've said it tonight, that a particular command is no longer binding on Christians today the way it was on Israel then. You hear me say stuff like that because I'm trying to be precise enough that I'm not misunderstood. And that's just an issue sometimes, but sometimes when that vagueness is there, it leaves an opening for someone to try to declare victory in a debate when they've argued for a point that actually both sides agree about. Both Rob and David agree that the 4 commandments are in the Torah, that they're part of the law of Moses. They both agreed they were required. Like, there wasn't, if the only debate was, is that stuff in the Torah, or is anything from the law of Moses, binding on the Gentiles, if that was the only thing that they were arguing about, there would be no argument. Christians have always thought that. Even Christians who say things like, that old law is no longer in effect. They're not speaking of everything that God ever commanded or everything you can find in it. They're talking about a specific body of commandments as that body of commandments tied to that covenant. They're speaking in a certain way when they say things like that. But it's, again, it's context, and so if you can just decide what things mean up front, then you can make things say whatever you want them to say. All right. Issue number 2, the actual 4 instructions, and whether they're found in the Torah. So if you've watched my channel any length of time, you've heard me talk about Acts 15. You know that I take the position that they're not all from the Torah, from the law of Moses. The four commandments that are given in Acts 15:29, 2 of them are directly from God's commands to his people. The prohibition against blood, which goes actually all the way back to Genesis 9, when God first gave animals to allow to be eaten. He said, you can eat animals, but don't eat the blood, for the life is in the blood, and all of that. And the sexual immorality. Those 2 things are clearly from written commands. We can find them. They're not there. There's no ambiguity. There's no question. The other 2, the one against food sacrifice to idols and strangled animals, are not explicitly found in any text of the Torah or any of the commandments. And I've said that over and over. That's been my position. So now Rob affirmed, he said, yeah, they're from the law of Moses. And a lot of people say that, and I've made the case, no, they're not explicitly there. One can argue for why, it was a common thing at the time to not, the thing about things strangled, I mean, that's really, you really only find it in this text and other texts that refer back to this text. Other times when the letter to the Gentiles is mentioned. It's not in the Old Testament. It's nowhere else in the New Testament except in reference to this council and the letter that went out. And then you've got the food sacrifice to idols, which is a very interesting topic, and I'm not going to spend a long time on it. I would recommend, if you go to, I have the 3-part, if you want to just hear like a good summary and with scripture of everything that I had to say about that, it's in my Torah Under Christ series. Acts 15 would be part 3, is where I would really, really dig into Acts 15, because it's about the arguments where scripture really takes on the Torah movements, and I talk about the defenses they make, and I talk about this whole issue. So I don't want to rehash that whole thing here, but I do want to play a clip of David talking about and making his case for why they are in the Torah. And again, it's only about 30 seconds, but I think it's instructive. Let me go ahead and grab it. So let's see. 13. So this is how David argues. And remember, since Rob didn't push back on this at all, he agreed with David that these are from the Torah. David didn't really have to spend much time trying to make that case. But here's a point where he does attempt to make that case.
3 food laws and 1 commandment against sexual immorality. All 4 commands of this apostolic decree are found in the law of Moses, and they are explicitly addressed to the strangers, that is, to Gentiles. For example, Leviticus 17 through 18 forbids idolatrous sacrifices, blood, meat from strangled animals, as well as engaging in sexual immorality. Moses requires not only Israelites to keep these commandments, but also Gentile believers. Acts 15:29 and 21:25 repeat these commands in the same order in which they appear in Leviticus.
Okay. So Leviticus 17, and then he goes to the Acts passages. So Leviticus 17 and 18, he says, now you notice he said it a little different. You know, David's real careful, and this is a thing that honestly I think works against him in the long run. People on his side may, you know, what works against him is he knows. You notice he didn't say their food sacrifice to idols. He said idolatrous sacrifices. Right? He mentioned strangled, but hey, and then of course the other, you know, blood and all that. I want to actually take a look at this this section. I've got the stream pulled up. All right, let's go to Leviticus 17. So the place of sacrifice, it talks about a few things here. Make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. All right. So we're just going to go pretty quickly here. But I just want to make sure we're on the right track. So in 17, and I'm just going to do something to help myself not go crazy. All right, take those out so I can read a little easier. So Leviticus 17, starting at the beginning, says, Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and to his sons and to all the Israelites, and you shall say to them, This is the word that Yahweh has commanded, saying, Any man from the house of Israel who slaughters an ox or a sheep or a goat in the camp, or who slaughters it outside the camp, and he does not bring it to the tent of assembly's entrance to present an offering to Yahweh before Yahweh's tabernacle, then that man shall be accounted blood guilty. He has poured out blood, and that man shall be cut off from the midst of his people. This is so that the Israelites may bring their sacrifices that they are sacrificing in the open field and bring them for Yahweh to the tent of assembly's entrance to the priest, and they shall sacrifice fellowship offerings for Yahweh with them. And the priest shall sprinkle the blood on Yahweh's altar at the tent of assembly's entrance, and he shall burn the fat as an appeasing fragrance to Yahweh, and they may no longer sacrifice their sacrifices to the goat idols after which they were prostituting. This is a lasting statute for them throughout their generations. So in this section, this is and we've talked about this passage before because this changes in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, when they're about to go to their cities and not be centrally located right around the tabernacle, he then says, you can go ahead and slaughter animals, for eating, in your cities. You don't have to bring them all here anymore. But, notice that the prohibition is not itself against idolatry, though that is obviously prohibited. It says, don't even slaughter an ox You don't even kill an animal, because, basically God knows the temptation of idolatry. I don't know, maybe they were doing this in Egypt or something. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on that too much. But in order to prevent idolatry, God simply prohibits any slaughter of animals except at the tabernacle. And so what we have here, and this is interesting, I think. It's going to be relevant to what we're going to talk about on these Torah commands. God gives a command. God has a greater command that is very important for people not to do. That is the idolatry. So he gives a command that makes it harder to break the more important command, right? He says, hey, don't even slaughter animals at all, because if you're away, I don't trust you people, to not do this and not to fall into idolatry in doing it. So we're going to have you do it here where the priests are there and everything is good, right? And it's so that they don't break an even more important commandment. So God in the Torah he does this. But if he does it in one place, what that shows us is that if he doesn't do it somewhere else, we're not to, if those are the places where God thought it was important to create this additional command. And remember, this additional command, don't slaughter anything anywhere, it's temporary. It only lasts for the time that they're wandering in the wilderness, and it ends when they go into the promised land. This command changes, and then it's no longer this fence around the greater command of not committing idolatry. So, but here's what we don't see yet, and won't see. There's no prohibition against eating food that other pagans sacrifice to their idols. That's not mentioned here. It's saying don't slaughter animals away because we don't want you getting caught up in actually doing idolatry. But it doesn't say anything about, and don't eat what the pagans, what the idolatrous nations around you have slaughtered in worship of their gods. It doesn't say that meat is no longer, available to you. Then the next section here is really about blood and things like that, but let's go ahead and read it. It says, you shall say to them, if there's anyone from the house of Israel or from the alien who dwells in their midst who offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice, and it does not bring it to the tent of assembly's entrance to sacrifice for Yahweh, that man shall be cut off from his people. This is kind of reiterating what we just read, right? And if there's anyone in the house of Israel or from the alien, this is where, by the way, this is where David's getting the idea that these are commands not just for Jews, but also for Gentiles. The thing that I would point out is that this is within the land, and in this case, they're not even in the land, they're wandering in the wilderness, but within the camp, within the people, if there's a stranger or an alien who's traveling with them or has kind of joined up with them, this is for them too. They're not to go against these. So David's not wrong. Let me put it to you this way. David's not wrong that thematically we have the stuff that underlies the Acts 15 commands here in Leviticus 17 and 18. He's not wrong about that. But he's just saying they're commands from the Torah. But the thing we always hear from the Torah folks when it comes to Jesus and the New Testament and all that stuff is he was against the people making up man-made rules, right? For the instead of what God commanded. That's the real problem, and they go to those passages where Jesus does that. But here we're gonna see if we've got some man-made rules on our hands, and what are we gonna do with that? Anyway, so yes, it is about both the native-born Jew and also the alien who's traveling with them, or dwelling in their midst, as it says. Says, if there's anyone from the house of Israel or from the alien who is dwelling in their midst who eats any blood, then I will set my face against the person who eats the blood and will cut him off from his people. Indeed, the flesh's life is in the blood, and I've given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your lives, because it is the blood of the life that makes atonement. Therefore, I said to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may the alien who is dwelling in your midst eat blood. And if there is anyone from the Israelites or from the alien who is dwelling in their midst, who hunts a wild game animal or bird that may be eaten, and then shall pour out its blood, he shall cover it with soil. Indeed, the life of all flesh, its blood, is in its life, so that I said to the Israelites, you may not eat the blood of any flesh, because the life of all flesh is in its blood. Anyone who eats it must be cut off. So far, we've seen that if don't eat blood, right? And if you do kill a wild game animal and you pour out its blood, you should cover the blood. That's the command that's been given. And if there's any person who eats a dead body or a mangled carcass, whether among the native or among the alien, then he shall wash his garments, and he shall wash himself with water, and he shall be unclean until the evening, and he shall be clean. But if he does not wash his garments, then he does not wash his body, then he shall bear his guilt. So again, if you eat an animal that's found dead, you become unclean. You need to wash your garments. Okay, so anything in there? So we've seen blood. We've seen the prohibition against blood, and we've seen prohibition against idolatry itself, and against slaughtering their domestic animals, out, in their, away from the tent. There's a mention of if you kill a wild animal. Obviously, they don't have to capture the wild animal and bring it there, so they can kill the wild animal in the wild. But then notice the command. The only command about the wild animal is if you drain the blood on the ground, cover the blood. That's what it says. Does it command them to drain the blood? No. But it seems to assume that's what they're going to do because of the prohibition against eating blood. And it says when you do that, cover the blood. So we have no mention of food that has been sacrificed to idols, meat that has been sacrificed by someone else, and that being prohibited. We have no mention of strangling. I have heard some people try to argue that the section about the wild animals is somehow a prohibition against strangling, but it's not. I mean, obviously, an easy way to drain the blood is to cut the throat and drain the blood. But that, again, it may be dead a number of ways. You're probably not going to strangle a wild animal to death. You're going to take it with a bow and arrow or something, like it's going to bleed out another way. Again, there's just no mention of strangling, no mention of food sacrificed to idols. Chapter 18 is all about sexual sins and various things that are prohibited there. So is sexual immorality, again, this affirms what I've said, what everybody agrees about, that the Torah does prohibit sexual sin. Yep, absolutely. No argument there. Okay, so that's what David argues is the thing that underlies what we're talking about. And I think, like I said, thematically, kind of, the food sacrifice to idols, and he says it's in the same order. And things that are kind of similar are in the same order. You've got the prohibition against killing your own animals in order to prevent committing idolatry comes first, and then you've got food sacrifice to idols first in Acts, and then you've got prohibition against blood, and then you got blood, and then you got the, if you drain the blood of a wild animal, but there's no mention of strangling, but that's the third thing, and then strangling, and then you've got the chapter 18 all about sexual immorality. Okay, but the point is, no. The 4 commandments, the 4 instructions, the 4 things, requirements in the letter to the Gentiles are not all in the Torah. They're just not. So, and this is a thing, I think, and in evaluating the debate, I think this makes things much more difficult for Rob to defend his position when he affirms, and gives up that position that the that the Torah, or that these 4 commandments are in the Torah, because now he's kind of stuck, agreeing with that, and it makes things a lot harder later when they're talking about, whether if it's part of the Torah, isn't that, if it's part of the law, they use the term law of Moses in the debate because that's the resolution. But if it is the law of Moses, it is the law of Moses, right? And it's like, well, but it's not the whole law of Moses. And Dr. Solberg said that many times. It's not the whole law of Moses. But then, David just kept bringing it back to, but it is the law of Moses. It is in there. It's not identical with the whole thing, but but in his opinion, that wasn't the debate, right? And so they kind of got to talking past each other, and that wouldn't happen if you make the case, that it's that it's from, or that they're not all in the Torah. Now another thing, and I don't have a clip for this, but David also made the argument that he thought the idea, let me see, that the food sacrificed to idols, the things which I'll give him this, and this is because he knows people like me exist. And so he's a little more careful than a lot of people in the Torah movements to say things that are technically accurate, and not make simple mistakes that a lot of folks do. And I think that, maybe he used to make these mistakes, but he tries not to, because he knows he's heard what I've argued. And so a lot of people in the Torah movements will try to say, and he kind of did it there, but he did it real fast. They'll try to take, Acts 15:20, where it says the pollutions, avoid the pollutions of idols, or, there's different ways that translations say that, but it's this more vague term. And then in verse 29, when we get the actual letter going to the Gentiles, it says things sacrificed to idols, that which is sacrificed to idols, or in other words, the meat sacrificed to idols. And a lot of people in the movement will fixate on verse 20 and just try to say, well, it's idolatry. That's all it really is. But then they won't ever acknowledge that that's not actually what was in the letter. David doesn't make that mistake. That's that elementary mistake. He does stick to that it's food sacrificed to idols that was in the letter, and therefore that's what's being discussed. But he did try to argue at one point that in the same way that sexual immorality is sort of a blanket category term for like all the specifics, like what you find in Leviticus 18, that the food sacrificed to idols, since that's food, is a sort of blanket term that applies to then Leviticus 11 and all the stuff that's unclean and all that. But I mean, obviously, that just doesn't work for a couple reasons. I mean, number one, the terms themselves, food sacrificed to idols is a specific concrete thing. It's not a category. You could say, well, there's, chicken and beef, and there's different types of animals. But like, no, it's a specific thing in the world. It's not a broad category the way sexual immorality is a broad category that encompasses a lot of different things. And also, it's just, I mean, there's in the Torah, in the law of Moses, in what's given at Sinai and beyond, the dietary stuff is not about whether it was sacrificed to idols. It's all about specific animals are considered unclean. They're not to be eaten. And because God wants to make Israel separate from the other nations, and they eat those things, and among other things, but there's certain things he wants to make them unique and special. So yeah, it doesn't have to do with idolatry. In other words, there's nothing. If God had said that, had a slightly different list of what was unclean in terms of animals, and they could eat that, it wouldn't change a thing about, idolatrous worship, and the prohibitions against that. If God had said that, different types of animals could be sacrificed and different types of animals could be eaten, but had all the same commandments about idolatry, that what they could eat wouldn't make a difference, because these are two separate things. And so the category is obviously related to idolatry, not which animals are which. So it just doesn't work. I mean, David, he tried a few things, but it just, again, doesn't work. And yeah, and also the thing I'd point out is that it's not just that food sacrifice to idols is more specific than sexual immorality. It's also that it was made more specific before the letter went out. That's an important thing to note, that before they actually sent the letter out, they wanted it to be clear, more clear than it was when James brought up the four things earlier in the discussion. They wanted that letter to be very specific. They wanted to be, hey, no, it's not just, and I think this makes sense based on my understanding of what's going on in that letter, in that these are Gentile Christians, and they have converted from being pagan idol worshipers to being Christians. The conversion itself is a repentance from idolatry. Now, that's not to say there's no temptation or anything like that, but it's just, that wasn't the issue. Remember, that wasn't it. What the controversy in Acts 15 had nothing to do with, hey, all you Gentile Christians are still engaging in idol worship. That was not the controversy. And so the fact that they changed pollutions of idols to something more specific, the food sacrificed to idols, really lends itself to the idea that they wanted to make this more specific. They were not giving a broad category that's supposed to encompass all the dietary laws or anything like that. So, but yeah, let's see. Yeah, so that's kind of just looking through my notes here. So the fact is, so how I would have engaged this debate is obviously very different from how Dr. Solberg did. I'm not, agreeing. I'm not even affirming or giving any credence to that. So David would have had to argue for that point, and he would have had a hard time. I can tell you, making that case without, again, a lot of inference and extrapolation. We'll talk a bit about that, but in this case, like, my position, on these laws being in the Torah or not, has no inference. It's just literally what's in the text. The text doesn't have it, so it's not in there. And he has to infer it. And I've always argued that to do that is to engage in the very adding of human traditions that Jesus condemned the Pharisees for. It's that's exactly what you're doing when you insist that these laws are from the Torah. But now, why is it important? What are some other implications? And again, this is something you can see in my other arguments. But the fact is, if the four instructions aren't all from the Torah, then it stands to reason they cannot be the starter, the first things that they have to do before they learn the rest of the Torah, because they're being given instructions that God never gave, before this. The closest it comes, is when they say it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. But that's not ever the way that God's commandments are described. Those are thus saith the Lord. It's not, it seemed good to, and from a human perspective, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to give you just these four things. So, but if these aren't all from the Torah, then they aren't starter Torah. They aren't starter, the beginning. They cannot function that way. If you want to argue for that, you can't even get that off the ground if you can't establish that they're all from the Torah. So that's why I think that's a much stronger position. It's more, in a way, I mean, it's less accommodating, but I don't know. I think it works. And I think it also establishes that the apostles and the elders who said that, and again, the text later on even says that this came from the apostles and the elders. This is ascribed to them, not to God necessarily. And there's a lot of things going on there, and that I don't really have time to get into. But the fact that is that it establishes them as, in a couple ways, it establishes their authority to govern the church, that they had this authority that it wasn't that they were giving commands from God, that it was this infallible thing, but it was that they had real authority to say, hey, we've got an issue. Here's what you should do because of this controversy, to put an end to this controversy. Here are our instructions for you. And it shows that they were not limited to just what was in the law of Moses in order to give good counsel. They were looking, and I think they were doing exactly what Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus talks about adultery and murder and these keeping your word and all this stuff, in the Sermon on the Mount, he's getting to the deeper principle that underlies the letter of the law. And, he's getting at something, he's doing something with the law that I think was always intended, is that we should think about it in these terms, and try to understand what's really going on, understand the principles involved, but also apply things contextually. And I think that's what they're doing. They're applying, and I think that David is right when he points to Leviticus 17 and 18 as sort of one of the foundational places where this wisdom is coming from. I think that he hasn't missed that part. But they're not just grabbing commands out of the Torah and saying, look, this is what you're required to do because it's in the Torah. No, because half of what they say is not found there. But things similar to those things are kind of found there, and reasoning around those things are found there. And if they're not giving commands from God, but rather good Christian, wisdom that is drawn on biblical principles, then that does make perfect sense. And they see that in their context, like avoiding strangled animals does help one avoid blood, and avoiding, food sacrifice to idols does help one not only kind of avoid idolatry, but also it just it leaves no question for things. And um, again, I'm not gonna make the whole case again that I made in my other video. You can go there, but it just makes sense, and in terms of what good Christian elders and the apostles would do, it fits right in with that. All right. Next issue, third issue. This one won't take too long. But David's use of sources. So in his opening statement, David tried to anticipate something Rob was going to do, which Rob actually never did, which is to argue that because these instructions from the apostles were at least partially human wisdom, that he was going to try to say that Christians aren't, required to do them, and so, they're just, contextual and things like that. And in order to counteract that, David, went down a list of citations from early church sources, early church fathers, Didache, things like that, and in which those sources affirm that these are binding commandments for Christians, that these four instructions are binding on Christians today, or at the time of those writers, and that certainly the early church thought that these were applied to Christians, and they didn't give any indication that they didn't. Now, for David, he's trying to make the case, since they're from the law, because that's his assumption, and these early church fathers affirm them. See, even the early church fathers agree with me, but of course they don't, and this is a problem. This is a problem for David and his use of sources, is that, and I'm not going to go. You can look up stuff. There's been some good stuff made, but even this isn't even something that is in dispute. David did not argue at any point that the early church fathers are Torah observers like he is. David never made that case. He made the case that they thought that the commandments given, in this letter were binding on Gentiles, and therefore binding on all Christians. And that's at least what his citations pointed to. I don't necessarily I haven't chased them all down, so I'm not coming down on either side of that. But he made that case, and then extrapolated that he wins the debate because, of course, they're from the Torah on his view. But he didn't make the case because it would be immediately, because he knows this case doesn't exist, that these early church sources are on his side when it comes to Torah observance, because all the sources he cited in other places talk about, the end of that old law and things like that. They understood the difference, but those early church sources also understood it with nuance, with not just saying, if you find it in the Old Testament, you can ignore it. No, they didn't say stuff like that. They did say, yes, we must obey God, and they recognized difference between moral and ceremonial law, though they might have used slightly different language for it. That kind of stuff was well understood in the early church. And, this is so well known that even a lot of people on David's side talk about how the early church just got off track right away and lost the connection to their, Jewish and Hebrew background and stuff like that. They lament that this happened in the early church. And David is well aware of all that. He didn't try to argue that that was the case, but again, he kind of leaves things unsaid because when it doesn't help him, but he's trying to make this case that these 4 commandments are binding on all Christians for all time. And I would say, probably not, and there's good reason to think so looking at other texts, but again, I've argued for that elsewhere. But the point is, even if that is true, even if and I'm not saying that he's necessarily wrong about what the early church sources he cited said, but even if he's completely right about that, it doesn't really establish anything like Torah observance and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so that's kind of one of the things he did. But then one thing I also wanted to do was show this one section where he talks about something just out of the blue. This is his very last section, his very last. They kind of went back and forth with 5-minute or 10-minute. Well, they start off with their 10-minute opening statements, and then they just kind of each had 5 minutes at a time to go back and forth and address each other's arguments. But something was said here right near the end in his very last address. This was never said earlier. It was never brought up earlier. And I'm of the opinion, now there were no rules about this in the debate, but in a good debate, in a good, solid, like this is how we do debate properly, you're supposed to, each side is supposed to make their case in the opening statements. The affirmative makes the case for the resolution, the negative makes the case against the resolution in their opening statements. In a normal debate, then they each have their rebuttals where they each criticize each other's opening statements. That's what they're supposed to do. And then in cross-examination, in typical cross-examination, which didn't happen here, they asked some clarifying questions, but they didn't really do, they did a little bit of cross-examination, but it's in typical cross-examination, they each have a time to ask questions to, poke holes in each other's position. Again, still, they shouldn't be bringing up stuff that wasn't discussed in the debate. In a lot of debates I've seen, cross-examination, that rule gets broken a lot. But then in their closing remarks, the closing statements are supposed to kind of basically remake their case, but now in reference to some of the things that have been said. So this debate didn't follow that format exactly, but it started with opening statements, and then each kind of went back and forth, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. But they knew they were on their last 5 minutes. They were making their closing remarks. And David had this to say, and I'm just going to play it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. But this was never discussed in the entire debate. And then David, in his very last section, this is what he says.
In his speech arguing that Christians should endorse same-sex unions, theologian and LGBT activist Matthew Vines appeals directly to Acts 15. Vines argues that Acts 15 clearly teaches that the law of Moses is not binding on followers of Jesus. Therefore, he says Christians are not required to keep the commands against same-sex practice given in Leviticus. He writes, quote, "In Acts 15, early church leaders gathered at what came to be called the Council of Jerusalem, and they decided that the old law would not be binding on Gentile believers. There is no reason to think that these two verses from Leviticus would somehow have remained applicable to Christians." End quote. Now, I am not claiming that Rob agrees with Matthew Vines on this topic. He does not, as far as I know. But Vines is taking Rob's basic interpretation of Acts 15 to its logical conclusion. If Acts 15 teaches that the law of Moses is not binding on Christians, then on what basis do we continue treating commandments from Leviticus as authoritative? Once we concede that the law of Moses is not binding on Christians, we have surrendered significant ground to progressive Christians and professing Christian LGBT activists. This is why this debate matters. Fortunately, Acts 15 does not teach what Matthew Vines or Rob Solberg claims it teaches.
Notice how he puts them together right there at the end. This is very, I mean, I'm sorry. I have no respect for this kind of debate tactic. Matthew Vines is a heretic, essentially. I mean, he's a guy that, yeah, he tries to push, the LGBT gay stuff on Christians and pretend that it is Christian. And he gets a lot of mileage out of the fact that in today's Christianity there is a lot of disregard for God's moral law. But here's the thing, he said he makes the same. Did you notice that? He said Matthew Vines makes the same argument that the law of Moses is no longer binding. But remember what case David is making. David's not making the case that the whole law of Moses is binding. He holds that circumcision is not binding on Gentiles. And, while he doesn't get specific, in this argument, he leaves it wide open that there's lots of stuff in the law of Moses that may not be binding. Now, I don't think that's really what he wants to argue for, but again, he's taking a much easier to defend position in the debate. The problem is that this quotation of Vines and this argument related, this guilt by association fallacy that he's committing against Dr. Solberg, he's doing this in total contradiction to the resolution he thinks he's arguing for. Because if all he has to do to prove his case is to prove that something from the law of Moses is still binding, then all his opponent has to do to prove his case that the law of Moses is not binding is to find something in the law of Moses that's not binding. And David thinks that circumcision is not binding on Gentiles. So they're both right. They both can declare victory. But that's not, again, the Matthew Vines' position is nothing like the historic Christian position, and it is not the logical outcome of Dr. Solberg's or the entire history of Christianity's position on obedience to God. It simply is not, for a multitude of reasons. Even those Christians who say we don't have to really look at anything from the Old Testament, we can just look at the New Testament, it's full of condemnations of being gay and all that stuff. It's full of condemnations of same-sex sexuality and everything that Matthew Vines is trying to argue for. So he doesn't, this trying to associate Rob's position with Matthew Vines' position is a complete farce in itself. But the fact that he waited till the very end of the debate to bring it up, when Rob would have no time to really, Rob is going to just make his final remarks, right? And he has no time to rebut that and to question David about that and bring up challenges like what I'm doing right now. It's just incredibly underhanded, and it does not show good faith when it comes to a debate like this. So yeah, I have no respect for him doing this, and this is not the first time David has brought up Matthew Vines in a debate about Torah observance. But yeah, anyway, that I just thought that was again, whenever, and I've made videos about this, when it comes to Rob's use of sources, always take it with a grain of salt, because there's a very good chance he's not doing it honestly, and I wish that weren't the case, but it really is. All right, moving on to the next thing. This is the next thing is how they handled verse 21. So let me jump back into, or actually, before I do that, let me kind of see how you guys are doing. See what's going on in the chat. I saw some activity a little bit. And yeah, this is a good one. Theo Megawordy says a lot of contracts have similar terms. It doesn't mean that they're the same as the other contracts, or that the members of the other contracts are beholden to the contracts with similar terms. Duh, lol. Exactly. I mean, I think this is going back to the four instructions, and are they from the Torah? Because even if they were all taken from the Torah, again, it does not establish that, Torah observance. And we're about to get into the topic of the starter Torah argument and all of that. If it were all from the Torah, I at least all that would do to my arguments regarding regarding everything here, it would take away one argument that I've been making, which is that you can't have starter Torah be 4 commands when half of them aren't even in the Torah to begin with. And that's an argument I've been making, that I wouldn't be able to make that argument if they were all from the Torah. But that still wouldn't establish Torah observance. It would just mean, I would have one less argument, but there's all the other ones too. So yeah, it's a very good point. Well made. Yeah, and then and then some stuff that I don't know. And then my wife Nikki had a little something to say about David's quotation of Matthew Vines and use of that. Yeah, that's kind of my take on it too. When I first heard it, it wasn't the first time I've heard him use that argument, but in listening to this debate, realizing we're all the way at the very end, and now he brings it up. So yeah, that's disappointing. But kind of what I've come to expect. So okay, so the next section, the next issue that I wanted to talk about is something that I thought was really good. So I watched Rob Solberg put out, even before I actually finished the whole debate. I'd listened to like most of the opening statements, but I hadn't finished the whole debate. And then a few days later, Rob, both guys put out videos talking about the debate. And I watched a good section of David's, and I'm going to talk about this stuff in a minute, but I listened to Rob's, and he had some interesting things to say, regarding inference and verse 21 and all that. So let's actually jump over. Let me jump over to Acts 15 here and show you what I'm talking about, so you know what this issue is about. So right after James mentions, so that this is sort of after the debate has kind of gone on a bit, and James is wrapping things up. In verse 19, he says, "Therefore, I conclude that we should not cause difficulty for those from among the Gentiles who turn to God, but we should write a letter to them to abstain from the pollution of idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood. For Moses has those who proclaim him in every city from ancient generations. because he is read aloud in the synagogues on every Sabbath. So this verse 21, James, so what's in the text? Here's what's in the text. James says, hey, we're kind of let's wrap things up. And here's what I conclude. We should instruct the Gentiles to avoid these 4 things. And the reason is that Moses has those who proclaim him in every city, and this has been going on from ancient generations. And because he's read aloud in the synagogues on every Sabbath. So Moses is read in the synagogues, and this has been going on for a very, very long time. Therefore, we should tell the Gentiles to avoid these 4 things. That's all the text actually says. Now, here's the thing. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to. My wife is with the kids, and she says, I had the middle kid with me when he started talking about same-sex stuff. Warn me. Yeah. Well, sorry about that. Anyway, all we have from the text is that James is concluding, hey, we should instruct. So we've debated about circumcision and whether they had the Holy Spirit, and if God accepted them without circumcision, and we established that God did accept the Gentiles without circumcision. And so here's what I think we should tell the Gentiles that they should do. And the reason we should give them these 4 instructions in particular is because Moses from ancient times has been read in the synagogues and continues to be to this day. That's all the text says. Now, Rob made a point in his post-debate things, but he says this in the debate, and I'm going to play that clip, that both he and David are inferring what that means. They have an explanation for what they think that means. And so I want to play these clips to give you an idea about, to give you kind of both sides, right? And I think you kind of know what's going to be here, but this is going to give you a little taste of it. So let's go back to the video here. All right. So the first one, this is David's position. You know what I like? I like that you can't even tell which direction I'm scrubbing this video. Am I going backwards or forwards? Going backwards. All right. So this is David giving his interpretation of what he thinks is going on. And I know we all know, but let's let him do it in his own words.
Of the early Christians. One other noteworthy feature of Acts 15 is verse 21, which says that Moses is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. I take this verse to mean that Gentile believers are going to hear the law read every Sabbath in the synagogues, and they will then apply that law to their Christian walk. I think this reading flows naturally from verse 20. In verse 20, the apostles required Gentile believers to obey 4 commands, each one taken directly from the law of Moses. Then in verse 21, they imply that these new believers will learn more of the Mosaic law each week, and over time end up keeping more parts of the law that applied to them. This seems like a very sensible reading of verse 21. Several scholars have defended it, and it's also not a new interpretation.
All right. So that's David's position, right? His position is that that the Gentiles are going to be in the synagogues and hear the law, and that they're going to learn the rest of the law. So that's why these 4 commandments are starter Torah, and then they're going to go be in the synagogues and continue to learn more. and that's how they become Torah observant. Okay, that's David's position, and we know that. I mean, that's everyone in the Torah movements says that about Acts 15:21. All right, let's hear something from Rob's position, and where he's arguing for now I want to preface this because the important thing here is not necessarily, well, we're going to talk about the two positions, but the important thing here is not let's hear both their positions. So Rob's position is that the purpose of these commands was to promote peace between Jew and Gentile believer, and also by extension Gentile believers in Christ and Jewish non-believers in Christ as well. That by abstaining from these things, and they would not put any undue barrier between them and the Jews, essentially, whether believers in Christ or not. That they would be sensitive to those sensibilities. These are the things that they should do, and that's what it means to, that when he mentions Moses has been read from ancient times, that's what he means, is that these cities are full of Jewish people who have been this way for many, many generations. Here's some things you can do that are going to not offend them. And this is also, I mean, this makes sense out of why they would give them instructions that aren't commandments, that are not commandments God ever gave, because it's a question of wisdom, not of commandment. And even though they call it a requirement, it's a requirement of wisdom. Just like there's a lot of things in modern society that we think people shouldn't do that aren't necessarily commandments of God. I mean, generally we think that we're going to get along better in society if we don't cuss like a sailor. That doesn't my opinion is there's no list of forbidden words in the Bible. But there are statements about, proper ways of speech and things like that. But I don't think it's automatically a sin to use a word that our culture, thinks is a cuss word. But it's wise in many contexts to not speak that way. I think there's many contexts where maybe having that be part of your vocabulary is also not a hindrance and actually helps you to just because it's relatable and things like that. But that's a whole different topic. My point is, there are things that wisdom requires, and so they are requirements, but they're not necessarily commandments. That's what I think. Anyway, that's basically Rob's position as well. I don't know, I can't remember if he really gets into it in this clip, but the thing I want you to hear in the clip is that Rob acknowledges he says, well, we're both making an inference. We're both adding something to try to understand what is the connection James is making between the 4 commands and the fact that Moses is read in the synagogues. What is the connection? We just heard David's, and we kind of know what Rob's is, but Rob is acknowledging this, and I think that this is a telling little interchange about that.
Oh, you can start okay. I will open up my rebuttal with a quick clarifying question. Does the text of Acts 15 explicitly say that the Gentiles will go to synagogues and learn the law of Moses?
It is implied in verse 21.
Well, we each have our own implications. So the text itself doesn't actually say that. That's a speculation on your part, just like my own speculation.
Right. So Rob acknowledges, and he goes into this in a little greater detail, even in his post-debate video that he did, in saying that, look, both sides have to infer something. neither side gets, from verse 21 itself, or verse 20 and 21 together, nobody gets to say their view is explicitly that this is what James was thinking when he made this connection in verse 21, when he says, we should do these because Moses is read. Both sides are inferring something. Now, David would not really acknowledge that. And he made several arguments, for why he thought, that it was proper and good, and that his argument fits with Scripture, and this comes. He went back to the Torah itself, and when the giving of the law was done, it was given a bit at a time and things like that. But whatever that thing is, whatever his arguments were for that position, he would not acknowledge that he was making an inference. And I mean, okay, you don't want to look weak. I think this was actually one of Rob's stronger points, is that he made the case very well that a lot of the that David's position, and really this is the Torah position on Acts 15:21, is this is one thing they all agree on, is that the Gentiles are going to learn the law. Well, that story about what's going on there in the verse is never borne out in the New Testament in any way. There's never an example of Gentile Christians going to synagogue, learning the Torah, growing in the Torah, or going to, David even postulated the existence of messianic synagogues, basically based on the fact that James refers to the assembly using that term, that Greek term for synagogue, but he doesn't explain what it means. He doesn't, I'm sure there's a great scholarly debate that could be had on what's going on there. But the fact is that there's nothing about, anything in the pastoral letters or anything in the rest of the New Testament that ever alludes to this interpretation of Acts 15:21 being the case. There's nothing in the Old Testament that indicates, that this is a sort of thing that Gentiles ought to do, related to the Old Covenant either. It's just not there. It's something that, David did his best to sort of try to see patterns that were similar to that, but they all have important differences as well. But I think the important thing here is that, Rob and really the vast majority of Christians, and this was a point he made that I thought was very good, is he pointed out, David's position is not like, he may be able to cite one or two or three people who've written something that kind of say something similar to what he's saying, maybe even agree with him and, part of his group. I don't know. But what Rob pointed out is that across all Christian denominations, and this is the position, this is universal almost, that, outside of the Torah movements, Catholic, Orthodox, every form of Protestant has looked at Acts 15 and said, yeah, this is where the church, took up the question of whether Christians were meant to do everything in the law of Moses the same way that the Jews always did, circumcision, all of that, and looked at the scriptures and looked at what God was doing and said, no, that's not necessary. Here's things that Gentiles should do, and they should do that because they are living among Jews, and that's what's going on. That has been that it's very, very, very widespread. Now, does that prove that it's true? Not necessarily, but I mean, wow. This is a high mountain to climb, and David didn't really try to climb it. I mean, he just basically just insisted that Rob was making up things, and he wasn't. and Rob, I think, very honestly and deftly pointed out, no, we both have to make an inference, but mine is a heck of a lot more likely. Now, I do want to make there's two arguments I want to make for this position, for Rob's position. And I think this is something I wish Rob had done a little better in the debate. First, the first point I would make, and actually, Rob did kind of make this point in the debate. He made a reference to this, but he didn't press the issue with David, and that is the wording of verse 21 is all past to present. There's nothing in verse 21 about the future. And Rob did make that point. There's nothing in the verse about Gentiles going to synagogue in the future, or Gentiles going to synagogue at all. What's in there is past and present tense verbs and things. It says, that Moses is read in the synagogues from ancient times. That's been going on from ancient times, and it's present. It's going on today, every week. So the context, the actual context, and the actual words in the verse are all about the past up to the present day, and the past informing how things are in the present day. So the way things are in the present day, in James's day, in the time that Acts 15 happens, are the reason why the 4 commandments are given. It doesn't mention the future. Which of the two inferences, Rob's inference that the 4 commands are about keeping the peace with the present day Jews, or David's position, that inference that the Gentiles are going to learn Torah in the synagogues in the future, which of those comports with the fact that verse 21 only has past and present in it? Well, obviously, Rob's position is the one that fits the actual grammar in verse 21. Is it still an inference? Is it still kind of an educated guess about what it means? Yes, but it actually fits the verse in terms of its grammar, whereas David's extrapolates beyond the grammar of the verse to guess at what else is going on. But also, and this is a very important bit, is that the immediate context, once we get just out of the council, is also very telling in that Rob's position and the historic Christian position happens again, or it happens more explicitly about another issue, and that is in chapter 16, the very next chapter, right at the beginning, we read this. It says, and this is about who is it? It's about Paul. At the end of it says, Paul chose Silas and departed. They disagree. Paul and Barnabas part company, and then Silas joins him, and they go through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So then what's it say at the beginning of 16? It says, and he came also to Derbe and to Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, a son of a believing Jewish woman, but of a Greek father, who was well spoken of by the brothers in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted this one to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him, because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So what happens here? This is one of my favorite verses to talk about, because people in the Torah movements, now, I don't know that David didn't bring up this verse at all. Nobody did in the debate. I really like this verse. A lot of people in the Torah movements really like this verse, because they just look at it very surface level and don't actually dig into the details. Verse 3 here says that Paul circumcised Timothy. And so many in the Torah movements will argue, well, if circumcision was done away with, as if, banned or something, which is, of course, never been the Christian position, that's what happened in Acts 15. Then how come Paul's doing it here? Clearly he thought it was still a commandment and still wanted to do it. Well, the text itself disproves it. The verse that they're citing disproves their interpretation of the verse, and one doesn't even have to try to see it. It's right there on the surface. It says Paul wanted Timothy to go with him. So Timothy had a Jewish mother and a Greek father. Today among Jews, there's a lot who believe in, basically it's only through the mother that a person is considered Jewish. So if you only have a Greek or Jewish father but not mother, then you're not truly Jewish. And I don't know where all that stuff comes from. But even those people would look at a verse like this and say, so Timothy was really Jewish because his mother was Jewish. Whether that has any relevance here, I don't know. But it's clear, we can tell from the context, that Timothy is a young man. We know he's young from the book of Timothy, 1 Timothy. But he's a young man who is, has mixed heritage. He's got a Jewish mother, Greek father, and he's obviously not circumcised when, he's a Christian. And when Paul comes to him and he's like, I want you to come with me, but I'm going to be going places like the temple in Jerusalem. And I want you to, and it says Paul wanted this one to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him. And why did he circumcise him? Because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew his father was a Greek. Why would it matter if he circumcised? What does that have? What does because of the Jews mean? Well, it's pretty obvious. There were places the Jews would not allow Gentiles to go because they're not circumcised. Now, Timothy had, he is half Jewish and apparently Jewish enough if he was circumcised to go in those places, and that's fine. But since he wasn't, Paul circumcised him. And does it say he circumcised him because of the law? No, it was because of the Jews, because of the people. And that is exactly what the traditional, widespread Christian interpretation of Acts 15:21 is also saying. That really when James talks about Moses being read, that's what he's referring to. He's referring to the Jews. He could have said, because of the Jews, we should have them do these four things. So we have that example. And then there's also the example, and Rob did bring this up, but he didn't really press it. But when Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 9 about, to the Jews, I live like a Jew and, in order to win the Jews. And when I'm among the Gentiles, I live like a Gentile in order to win the Gentiles. And so I live like one under the law and I live like one not under the law. But of course, I'm still under the law of God because I'm under the law of Christ. So Paul makes this clear, and I think it's a beautiful passage because, for many reasons, it really expresses the Christian position regarding the law. That we are under the law, we're under the law of God in Christ, but it's different than the law of Moses that the Jews were under the old covenant. The Sinai covenant. So why do I bring that one up? Because it's the same thing that, you know, as Christians in those days, living among, Jewish populations and among Gentiles, that we should contextualize our faith, of course, not going into sin. As Paul said, I'm not outside the law of God. Even though I'm not under the law of Moses, I'm still under the law of God. So he differentiated between those two things. I still have to obey God. So I can't just do anything because I'm among Gentiles who are not under the law. But I can live in a way that contextualizes it so that I'm not offending them. And I will also live as one under the law when I'm among the Jews. Just like he did in circumcising Timothy. He had Timothy with him and had him living like one under the law. I mean, he's a grown man. He could have, but he never got circumcised, and it didn't, we don't have any indication that it was any kind of big issue. But, it became an issue when Paul wanted to take Timothy with him into these places and among the Jews, and Timothy wasn't living like a Jew, so to speak, being uncircumcised. So he wanted to make sure that, let's take care of that to take away the controversy that would come about. So there's several passages. So, both the grammar of the verse itself is about past and present, which lends itself to the traditional understanding. And the very next chapter gives us an example of doing the very same thing, doing something that they're not commanded to do. And I think this is part of the reason David didn't bring it up, is because he doesn't think that Gentiles have to be circumcised, but they do have to keep the law. He sees these as separate things. And here's Timothy getting circumcised. I don't know what David actually thinks, if Timothy had to do that according to the law because of his Jewish mother, or if he thinks that it was just something that he did in order to keep peace with the Jews. He runs into problems with other things he said, he kind of either way, I think. But I don't really know. I mean, I'll if he ever talks about it, I'll see what he says. My point is, we have these several examples of the traditional view of verse 21 right there in the text, that sort of thing happening. We don't have anything like the sort of thing that David argues for happening in the New Testament with Christians, that kind of thing. It's just absent. It's just a story that is being told about the text that isn't actually in there. So anyway, so let's see. Okay. All right. So just a couple of things. We're getting down to the end here. So second to last, I do want to, I meant to grab the thumbnails. Maybe I will, actually, this could be fun. I will, let me do this. You can watch me go find these videos and show you what I'm talking about. Let's see. Biblical. Let's go to Rob's channel and see. Here's his most recent video. He says, "What I learned from my debate on Acts 15 with David Wilber." This is the video he put out after the debate to kind of talk about what happened in the debate. Let's look at what David did. This was David's video. Did I win my debate with R.L. Solberg on Acts 15? Several times, and I played you a couple examples, but several times he definitely talked about what he thought was going on in the debate, and what he thought, whether he won or whether he's established the resolution, that kind of stuff. He's very focused on that during the debate. And then after the debate, you know, that was his video. Now, I'm not going to say too much. You know, I'm not going to make a huge, haha, look at this. Look at how, you know, mature Rob is and how immature David is. That's not exactly what I'm wanting to focus on. I watched all of Rob's video and I wanted to hear the things he thought he learned. And I caught kind of the beginning bits of David's video. And in David's video, he's asking this question because he got some comments where people said he technically like won, but they still disagreed with him. And that's, in a way, they're saying that because they're accepting David's definitions of terms and David's interpretation of the resolution. And even people, these are people even who disagree with David, but they're accepting his definitions and his interpretation of the resolution, and therefore saying, well, yeah, you technically established that, but you didn't. I don't agree with you because you didn't establish like Torah observance, and he didn't. And really, as I said, what he did establish is what we kind of all agree on anyway, that there's things in the law of Moses that are binding, and it's not. And what I've said over and over is that it's because they're moral laws that have always been binding even before the law of Moses was a thing, and continue to be. And I'll say this too about Rob's video, that he, to be fair, and give a fair critique of Rob's video, the things he learned often did have to do with ways he could have argued better because of things that David was wrong about. He, you know, it wasn't necessarily like, oh, I was really wrong about XYZ, but it was like, you know, I was wrong about XYZ, and if I'd had that right, I could have even better argued against David because David was really wrong, you know, kind of stuff. So Rob wasn't like admitting like, oh, David made some really good points or anything. So, I mean, they're both talking about it in a sense of, you know, I'm still right and that kind of thing. But I do think that how they're coming at it, you know, does show a difference in their awareness of what they were doing in the debate. Again, this comes down to really what I think the main takeaway is, and it's something that it's what I started with, that you have to, you know, a debate has to have precision when it comes to the resolution, that everybody knows what is being, you know, argued for and against it, that it, you know, a vague term like the law of Moses that can mean a whole bunch of different things. And in this case, the problem being that one's saying, you know, only talking about part of it and the other's talking about the whole, and they're arguing past each other. And it got, the debate kind of got bogged down in that, you know, so I think that was the biggest takeaway for me, was that the debate could have been a lot better if that issue were not an issue in there. I thought Rob did a good job, you know, really kind of pressing David on verse 21 on the issue of the, you know, gradual learning stuff, and I think that was pretty good. You know, I guess if I had to, you know, my biggest criticism, I'm going to give, you know, kind of a criticism for each guy. I think that the issue with the resolution is something that is an issue that I think Rob deals with from time to time, and that is that he's not always super precise. And that's, again, it's something that we all, miss at various times. But I think he assumed that there was a shared understanding about what the resolution meant, and that was a problem. I've seen, I've seen Rob do a lot better in other debates where things were a little better defined. I guess my main criticism with David, of course, obviously aside from the obvious disagreement about his entire theology, is it seems he cares more, honestly, more about winning than he cares about the truth. And I don't just mean that because, we disagree, therefore he doesn't have the truth. I mean even the truth about simple facts, things that shouldn't be up for debate. The simple truth is that both sides believe that certain commandments in the law of Moses are still binding on Christians today. Both sides agree with that. We obviously, and so if both sides agree about that, why make a big deal about the fact that, you believe laws that are in the law of Moses? It doesn't actually gain anything. It doesn't actually get anybody closer to the truth of whether Torah observance theology is correct or not. It just reiterates something we agree about and pretending that it's an argument for your position. David's a Trinitarian. And if he's dealt with Unitarians, he probably knows that they have two basic favorite arguments. One argument is that, look, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit aren't identical. Like, they're not the same person. They're distinct. Look, see, here's the Father and here's the Son, and they're talking to each other, and they're different. Jesus wasn't praying to himself, yada, yada, yada. And that's one of their favorite arguments, is to show the distinction between the Father and the Son. Well, as Trinitarians, we just sit back and shake our heads like, why do you think that's an argument? That's one of the key, pillars of the Trinity, is distinguishing between the persons. If you don't distinguish between the persons, you have modalism, and we don't agree with that. So why are you pretending like that matters? I mean, that's, if you go back and watch my videos responding to Sean Griffin and his arguments against the Trinity, he's constantly arguing against modalism like it's the Trinity. And it's silly, because what is he doing? He's taking something Trinitarians actually agree with and pretending like it's an argument against the Trinity. The other thing that they like to argue is they point out the humanity of Christ. And again, that's a pillar of Trinitarian theology, that Christ is both God and man. But they argue that see, if he's human, therefore the Trinity's false because you think he's God. It's like, no, we think he's both. We agree with that part. Like, you need to show me something that disagrees with me if we're going to argue. And David would agree with that. He would agree with that. Because he's a Trinitarian. But when it comes to the issue of Torah observance, in this debate, he just he did exactly what the Unitarians do, and with the Trinity, and he just took something that both sides agree on and hyped it up like it matters, like it proves his position is true and the traditional Christian's view is false. And it just doesn't. It doesn't do that, because that's something we agree on. And so my criticism is, how about arguing the actual case? How about arguing, let's get at the truth. Let's get at where we disagree and see if your position holds up when we start talking about that. But that's kind of what happened. So I want to just finish up by saying a few things. I won't. It's easy, and I want to acknowledge this. It is easy to sit here afterwards and poke holes in things and to offer criticisms, because I'm not sitting there under a timer in the debate, and I'm not pretending that I would have done so much better than Rob or anything like that. It's something so put together so quickly. um who knows what would have happened. um but I do think that it would have been an interest. It would be interesting to hear David actually clash with the idea that no, all the four instructions aren't from the Torah, that kind of thing. Or those things would have been cool. But we can always look back at our performance in the past in live situations and say what we could have done better. And no, I want to put this out there. I'm not planning on challenging David to debate this topic all over again or anything like that. I think that this episode of the show is a good, thing to kind of make these points, and I, maybe he'll say something about it. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. To me, at the end of the day, what matters is the truth. Like I said at the beginning, what matters to me is getting into the text and getting after the truth. I do hope someday to be in a position where I can prepare for and engage in a live debate. Hopefully, maybe even pretty soon. And I do hope, we've had some communication in the past about debating a couple different things, and I do hope that does happen at some point. I will say I don't plan on, saying, okay, let's do it, 3 days from now or something. I take some time when it comes to preparation, but we'll see. I'm not announcing anything. I'm not challenging anybody. I'm just saying, I take that kind of thing pretty seriously. It's why I've done very few debates myself. I've been in a spot in my life where I could really devote time to studying the issue, my opponent's arguments, all that stuff to really try to be prepared for anything that might happen. I take my time when it comes to that stuff. And I just barely got stable enough to start doing these live streams once a week. And so we'll see when I get to the point where I can do other stuff like that. But anyway, I thought it was a very interesting debate, and I thought it was worth saying some things about. So I hope it's been helpful for you guys and all that. But let's see, any at someone at okay. Yeah, anyway, looking back here at the chat, anything that might have been relevant. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times you've got the chat showing so you guys can see, but I think I'll leave it at that. And if there's anybody, if you have any questions or thoughts on tonight's episode, anything you wanted to ask or anything, you're certainly welcome to do so. See people still here wanting to, that have been listening. I appreciate you guys being here for that. But if there is not, that is fine too. I hope this has been useful for you guys, and I look forward to hopefully getting back at it again next week, and we will see what happens there. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and sign off and say that I appreciate you guys so much for being here for Beginning of Wisdom Live, and look forward to seeing you when I see you. Thanks so much.